many people are afraid of snakes and bats, even though that fear is predominantly unfounded. So our project was to go over these two species, or well, not species, but two animals, and talk about all of the great things about them and talk about some common fears and misconceptions that are associated with them and kind of dispel those myths. But another reason that I really wanted to do this is because some of us went to a bat conference just I think a couple months ago now down in Athens, Georgia. And it was really great because we got to go around and we got to learn all about these bat projects and other small mammals and speak with a lot of grad students doing very specific work with these animals. And as I was at one poster presentation, there was a professor there presenting for a student because she was gone. And I was talking to him about our project because I thought, you know, he's like going to be super stoked about this. We're telling people not to be afraid of bats. And he could not believe that people were afraid of bats. Like when I told him that was our project, he's like, well, people aren't afraid of bats. That's just silly. Where are you getting that information from? And so Chandler put together a cute little video for us, and I'm going to screen share that with you right now. There we go. So that was just a few of the screenshots that she was able to get of other people's fear or disgust or distrust of bats and snakes. So here to help dispel those myths with us today are Dana Bradley and Katherine Etchison. I hope I'm saying that right. Dana is covering snakes and Katherine is covering bats. And here to give us her presentation is Dana.
All right, hi everybody, can you hear me? Thumbs up. All right, great. So yeah, like they said, I am Dana Bradley. I'm the Outdoor Programs Director for a nonprofit called Rutherford Outdoor Coalition here in Rutherford County, North Carolina. And I absolutely love my job. I get to lead group hikes and river floats and be outside a lot of the time. And so it's a fantastic job for someone who does love snakes like I do. I get to see them a good bit. And I'm going to share some slides with you about that and tell you a little bit more about my background and how I came to love our little scaly friends so much. So I hope you enjoy it. So from the time I was just little, I loved anything to do with wildlife. I loved it all. I was picking up spiders and snakes and everything, and I just loved it. And so when I was 5 years old, I found a little baby garter snake in our garden and showed it to my mom, picked it up, and she was not real happy that I was handling a snake, but she didn't discourage me from my passion for these. And I just really loved it. So I think I was about 12 when I picked up my next one, and I did a lot of research beforehand to get a little better at what I was doing. I worked at a farm, and there were lots of snakes on that farm, so I got a lot of snake handling experience there too. And then loving these like I did, I figured, why not major in what I love? And so in 2011, I graduated from Clemson University, got my degree in wildlife biology, and then I had several field jobs working with snakes, and it has just been a wonderful journey. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about all of that. So while I was working at this farm, there were lots of typical farm animals. you had your cows and horses and chickens, things like that. And when you have animal feed, you're going to have some mice and rats that move in to try to benefit from that feed. And that also brings in snakes. And it brought in tons of black rat snakes, which I was thrilled about. And I was a little standoffish at first because some of them were over 6 foot long. They were really big. But I finally did some research on how to safely handle them and started. And so actually the first picture you see on that screen in the upper left, that is actually the first large snake that I had picked up, and it's over 6 foot long. It's a black rat snake, and I was fascinated, loved it. It was amazing. I was very careful. And then, I just got more and more experience as it went on. I learned how to safely handle them by their head and things like that. And then in 2012, I got a job as a small mammal and herpetofauna technician. And so I was working directly with lots of snakes every day. We would, as part of the job, we would, once we found them, we would age them and sex them, identify them by species, and then we would let them go. And we had about 10 different sizes of tubes, like you see in the picture there, that we would keep in our backpack. And we would use them to put over any venomous snake's head, and so we could handle them safely. That is actually a timber rattlesnake in that picture that I'm holding. And I believe it had about 5 buds on the tail. It was really beautiful, beautiful specimen. In 2014, I was a small mammal research assistant. And that job, even though it was working with small mammals, for the most part, there were snakes everywhere. And so we actually got a lot of snakes by accident that I got to work with. And so I was very, very happy about that too. So these are some of the pictures from my field work in Alabama and Mississippi. So we have the eastern garter snake, diamondback water snake, the rough green snake, our ringneck snake, and eastern hognose snake. Those were some of them that I found and were able to examine, and it's really beautiful species. And we have all of those here in North Carolina except for the diamondback water snake. That was a little added bonus I got to see while out there. So I want to ask you a question. Are you afraid of snakes? Just leave a comment. Tell me yes or no. And that way we can see where everyone stands on this. If you are afraid of snakes, just tell me why. All right. Yeah, it looks like a lot of people are, and some aren't. Some really like them.
I'll read out some of the chat responses to you. Like Samantha chatted that if I'm hiking in a region of the country I'm not familiar with, I keep a healthy distance from ones I can't ID, but not scared. She loves them. See quite a bit of not scared, some saying they're cool, but they do scare me a little bit. Not completely afraid, but feel like they're unpredictable. That they're afraid because their parents are super scared, and so kind of learning that fear from them, which is pretty common. I tend not to see them and nearly step on them, so that makes me a bit scared. But if I see them, I'm fine. The mixture of responses.
Okay, great. I might get you to help me with those responses as they come in.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, great. Yeah, so there's a lot of reasons that people are afraid of snakes. There's really a lack of understanding about snakes, and I really hate that. I hope more people start to learn more about them because they're really fascinating. People kind of fear what they don't understand. Maybe you were brought up and your parents or family told you that snakes were bad or they were dangerous and they're all mean and they're out to get you, and that's just not true. There's a very small percentage that are actually dangerous to humans. In movies, stories, and other media, absolutely portraying them as evil. There's movies like Anaconda and even funny ones like Snakes on a Plane. Even though, it's funny, they're all portraying snakes as out to get you and kind of evil and biting everyone, things like that. And that's not the case at all. They're actually little happy critters and just want to go about their way. Maybe you've had a bad experience with a snake. Maybe one's hissed at you, or maybe you've actually been bitten. That would definitely lead to a fear of snakes. There's evolution and genetics that they think is passed down through generations, and they're still doing research on that as to why exactly that is. But I'm hoping we can fix some of that today. So when people are afraid of snakes, it can cause a lot of bad reactions. So it can cause a fear of the outdoors, which I really don't want at all. I don't want people to be afraid to go outside because they might run into a snake. That's actually the highlight of my day. People can become afraid to go hiking or swimming, camping, anything like that, because there is a possibility that you're going to run into a snake. But it can also cause a lot of harmless snakes to be killed out of fear, and I hate that. I get a lot of pictures people send me of snakes that they've already killed and ask me to ID it, and 90% of them are harmless snakes. And I really hate that. I really wish they'd send me pictures ahead of time so I could tell them what it is and to please not harm it. Sometimes attacking a snake will sometimes lead to a snake bite. It really could have been avoided. And it also leads to passing on some incorrect information and fears to other people that they might not have had. So it's very important to know about snakes. And there's a million reasons why, but I'll just go over a few of them. So being prepared when you're going hiking, camping, kayaking. I know most of the AmeriCorps members, this is probably what you do all the time. Love to be outdoors. So being able to do that and have all the correct information before going is wonderful. Being able to share the right information with other people instead of passing on some of the myths and misconceptions that we're hearing. That would be nice. And then plus every now and then you can come off sounding really cool when you can spout off a few cool facts, like the reason why a snake's tongue is forked is actually because it can sense chemical differences in the two different directions and tell where different predators and prey are located. So pretty cool. And so I'm going to go over some common myths and misconceptions that we probably all heard about our snake friends. The first one is snakes are slimy. I hear that all the time. People don't want to touch snakes because they think they're slimy. That couldn't be further from the truth. Snakes actually have really smooth skin, and the scales they're dry, and it's made up of scales, and it's kind of like our fingernails. And if you're touching a snake, you should only do that in one direction, and that's from head to tail. It can actually damage the scales if you're rough with them and rub from the other direction. And so, and this whole entire skin stretches as the snakes get bigger, and they need to shed that skin every now and then. And it's really neat when they're about to shed, their eyes will actually turn a shade of blue. And you'll see that in some of the pictures I have coming up. It actually will turn back clear right before the skin comes off. And we actually had some snakes at the farm, some of the about 6 foot long ones that I caught them right after they shed. And so I have intact snake skins that are 6 foot long, and they have the entire head, eyes, and everything included. And so those are really neat. Snakes shed probably 2 to 4 times a year, and even more often when they're young. It just depends on how much they eat and how much they're growing. I often hear that snakes are deaf, and that's definitely not true. So while they don't have actual ears, they do have an internal sensory organ that can detect vibrations. And so they're able to hear low frequency sounds, not necessarily a lot of high pitched stuff, but they can hear you. They also use their tongues to sense smells and determine where predators and prey are around them. So that's kind of neat. I hear a lot. I've seen actually some memes talking about snakes dislocating their jaws when they eat. And it's true. They can eat prey that is much bigger than their actual head, but they actually don't have hard fused jaw bones like we do. They're really flexible. And so they're able, where the ligament joins the lower bones, they have an additional flexible bone in the back that allows them to open their mouth completely wide open. And that comes in handy when they're eating things that are much bigger than their head is. And like the rattlesnake that was in the picture of me earlier, you actually cannot tell the age of a rattlesnake by counting the rattles. So the way it works is they add a rattle at the end of each time they shed, and they can shed, like I said, multiple times a year. And sometimes they're pretty brittle. And so if it gets stepped on or a predator gets a hold of it, the rattles can actually break off. And so you might only be seeing 3 when it had 6 or 7. So you can't always go by that. Oh, one of my favorites. Snakes are poisonous. Yeah. The rule of thumb is that if you eat it and you get sick, then it's poisonous. And if it bites you and you get sick, then it's venomous. So I don't know if you want to go around licking snakes. I wouldn't imagine. But the snakes around here would probably be pretty harmless if you did. And only about 7% of the snakes around are dangerous to humans. So that's something to keep in mind. This is just a small handful that are actually venomous. Now, there are no poisonous snakes in the United States. However, there is one exception to the rule. So in Japan, the Japanese grass snake is actually both poisonous and venomous. It absorbs toxins from the toads and frogs that it eats, and it stores them in glands just behind its head. And if it's threatened, it'll actually raise those glands and secrete some of those toxins. So it's actually poisonous to predators that eat it, which is really cool. And it actually is venomous as well. It can bite. It rarely bites humans because its fangs are actually located in the back of its mouth. And so it's hard to get a hold of something that's larger than it is. It's built for, eating rats and rodents, things of that sort. Another one I hear is that snakes are out to get you, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. They would be happy just to go about their business, and they're just trying to find food and get warm and sunbathe, and I'm sure we can all identify with that. So we're much bigger and faster than they are, and they view us as a predator. So they're mostly just trying to stay away and get away from us. And as a last line of defense, if they feel cornered or threatened, that's when they're likely to lash out and bite. But they don't want to waste their venom. So oftentimes, some of the venomous snakes, when they do bite, it's a dry bite. So they actually don't inject venom 100% of the time. One of the things, and I'm sure maybe some of you have seen a video on YouTube of this, if you cut the head off of a snake, it does continue to move around. So it's not entirely false that snakes can live after their head is cut off. The snakes are cold-blooded, and so that means its brain stays alive longer than a warm-blooded animal would. And so it actually, after you decapitate a snake's head, it actually can deliver venom. It actually can bite for several hours afterwards due to reflexes and things like that. And it can actually feel pain during this time. So it's actually kind of cruel to cut the head off a snake. That's not a good way to kill it. So I definitely want to discourage that as much as possible. So let's talk about some benefits. Snakes are wonderful creatures, great for the environment, and let me tell you about some of the reasons why. Population control, rodents. I am not a big fan of rats and mice and things like that. And so one female rodent can lead to a generation of over 5,000 new rodents in 1 year. That's a lot. And so a black rat snake can consume 9 pounds or 200 rodents in that lifetime. So, or in a year. And so that's 100 to 150,000 rodents in its lifetime. Thank you, Mr. Black Rat Snake. I will take that. And ticks. The timber rattlesnake can consume 2,000 to 4,000 ticks per season. I can't imagine what this world would be like without some of these snakes. And then some of our non-venomous snakes, like king snakes, can kill and eat other snakes, including venomous snakes. They actually have a natural immunity to pit viper venom, and that's why they can eat them. So those are great snakes to have in your yard. Some other benefits, they're a food source for other animals like hawks and owls, skunks, raccoons, things like that. And so they're an important part of the food chain. And then their venom is actually used to treat some conditions like high and low blood pressure, some chronic pain, strokes, and even some cancers. So it's really beneficial. I don't know if I could have the job of being a person that milks snake venom for a living. I think that would be really interesting, really stressful. What do y'all think? Somebody's got to do it, right? All right, so there's some important steps you can take to prepare for seeing a snake out. There is a highly likelihood that we will all see a snake out at some point. So the best way to prepare for this is just to do your research. Know what you're looking at. Look at the places that you're going to go hiking and camping before you go, so that you know what types of snakes and other animals can be in that area. And then you also find some great, incredible finds that you could look for while you're there. And so it's good to know your area. You can ask local rangers, field guides, ask local biologists, anything like that. Everyone's happy to help. I am always happy to help if anyone has any snake questions about identifying them or anything like that. Understand your habits for local snakes. So during the heat of the day, they're very likely to be out basking on a rock somewhere, trying to get warm, or in a roadway, something like that. That's why you see a lot of them getting run over. They're just trying to get warm, and they pick a very bad location. So knowing when they're likely to be out, and then in the colder parts of the day, the morning, things like that, they're likely to be hidden under rocks and other places. It's also good to know which ones are really rare. We have some threatened and endangered snakes, and it's good to know which ones they are, so you can be especially careful not to injure those. And so when you do encounter a snake, it's pretty easy. So number one, leave it alone. I've had a lot of training, both formal and informal training, on how to handle snakes, and that is why I do it. And when I see snakes, I try to, if it's harmless, I will pick it up to show people, that they're really nice, and I try to use it as an education tool. Do not do that if you don't know what snake you're going towards. Most snake bites occur from people that are trying to interact with snakes. They're trying to pick it up, they're trying to poke at it and get it to leave, they're trying to kill it. And a very small percentage of snake bites actually are fatal. So there's really no reason to kill these snakes. You can also walk far around the snake, give it a wide berth if you see it. A lot of cameras have excellent zoom lenses on them now, so there's no need to get super close to it. You can get a good picture from far away. They have really poor eyesight, and so if they feel trapped, they may try to escape in a wrong direction and may end up actually coming towards you. They're not actually charging you, they're just trying to get away. And you should always avoid their strike zone, which is about half of their body length. They can strike a pretty good distance, so always just be careful. So in other words, you need to social distance yourself from snakes even when it's not a government order. And so if you get bitten, first of all, don't panic. It's okay. You just, the lower your heart rate is, it'll circulate more slowly. You don't want the venom to spread quickly. And so just relax, take some deep breaths. It's going to be okay. You can try to identify the snake. That's really going to help. If you get to the hospital, they need to know if you need antivenom, what kind to give you. Focus on keeping the site that you were bitten clean, things like that. If you have access to soap and water, wash it off. If you have alcohol wipes, even better. Just disinfect the area. Snakes can have some bacteria in their mouth as well. Definitely don't try to suck the venom out. This is not effective. All it does is kind of keep the venom in one spot, and it's not good. Also, don't apply a tourniquet, because that, again, will keep the venom in one particular spot, and then it can actually do a lot more damage with it not being able to spread out in the system. Get to the hospital as soon as you can, of course, and call them ahead of time and give them any information you have about the snake it was, what it looked like, if you don't know what species, so they can try to prepare for your arrival. But hopefully this never happens. All right, let's do a little snake trivia. Y'all ready? So how many species of snakes do you think we have in North Carolina? Got some choices up there for you. So just use the comment box and weigh in.
We have a guess for 17, 25, more 17s. Yeah, so far 17 and 25.
All right.
And we have one guess for 37.
Okay.
Another guess for 37. So kind of all over the place, lots of guesses. No 12s though. Everyone thinks of more than that.
All right, well, those are all excellent guesses. And so, yeah, we actually have 37 species of snake here. Yeah, so we actually have 37 species of snakes in North Carolina. And that's amazing to think of. 37, that's a lot. And I love every single one of them. They're all my little friends. I'll go over some of those different species with you in just a bit. So we have another question. Of those 37 snake species, how many do you think are venomous? You think it's 3, 6, 10, or 25? Let me see your guesses.
We have quite a few for 3. We have some 6s.
Okay.
More 3s. Yeah, so mostly guesses of 3 and then a couple guesses of 6.
Okay. All right, good. So no one thinks that we have 25 venomous snakes?
No.
That would be a lot. I think we're in the wrong country for that.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you guess 6, you are absolutely correct. We have 6 venomous snakes in North Carolina, but actually only 4 of them are found in Western North Carolina. So there's only 4 of them that we have to actually deal with here. And that is a point I definitely want to talk about. A lot of people tell me, that they've seen cottonmouths and things up in this region, and that's just not the case looking at it logistically. So they look very similar to our northern water snakes, and I think that's what a lot of people are seeing. I've had people send me a lot of pictures, and it's always a water snake, and they say that it's a water moccasin, a cottonmouth. Cottonmouth is a type of water moccasin, but the general rule of thumb is they like marshy lands. So if you can have alligators in your area, you can have cottonmouths. And so we don't have gators around here, and so we don't have any cottonmouths. And then coral snakes, they live towards the coast. And we don't have any of those out here either. So we've only got 4. I want to go over a little quick tidbit. I get a lot of questions from people that ask me, you know, about having snakes as pets. Some snakes can actually make good pets, but my #1 rule is wild snakes do not make good pets. Please do not go out and find a wild snake and bring it home. It doesn't want to go home with you. It wants to live its natural life, and so we should always respect nature and do that. Venomous snakes, I feel, should never be kept as pets unless you're a trained professional and you're using it for something. It's really dangerous to have that in your house, especially if you have a family and you're not properly trained. It could get loose. There's a lot of factors that could go along with that. So I always try to steer people clear of that. If you're going to have a pet snake, I do have some recommendations for ones that are really good natured and really handle being picked up and handled well. The corn snake is one of my favorites. And then the California king snake, the rosy boa is very popular, the gopher snake, and then ball pythons. You of course want to have all your correct enclosures, everything that they need, source of heat, and find out everything you can before having one of these as a pet. You want to make sure that you can take care of it as well as possible. All right, so I'm going to go over a few of our little snake friends that we have here in North Carolina. I don't have time to go over all 37 of them. I apologize. So one of my favorites is the eastern hognose snake. It is an amazing snake. They actually have a little upturned nose that they use for digging in the ground and finding their prey, little insects and little small rodents, things like that. They are often mistaken for some very venomous snakes. They will put on quite a display for you. If you approach them and they feel threatened, they will first flatten out their head to look similar to a cobra, and they will actually sometimes take the cobra stance out at you. They will hiss very loudly, put on quite an act. They will fake bite at you, act like they're going to bite you, but there has never been a report of a person being bit by a hognose snake. They just don't. And if you keep messing with it, they will actually play dead. And it's quite a show, very dramatic. They will stick their tongue out. They have a musk that they can secrete from their cloaca, and they will secrete that and they'll writhe around and they'll roll that all over their body, and so they actually smell dead. One of my favorite snakes. They're amazing. And so you can see exactly how much of a drama queen they are. I have a short video for you to watch.
Oh, hello there. You with the camera. Yes, I am a snake. You should back away. I am very dangerous. Do not touch me. Don't touch me. I will bite you and you will die from my poison. Do not touch me. Look at me. I am dangerous. I told you I am dangerous. Don't. Ah, you have killed me. Oh, look, I am dying from your stinky touch. Oh, so dying, so dying. Oh, yes, dying. I am dead. No, I am dead, snake. You don't touch me. Oh, so dead. Oh, I am so dead. Oh, yes, you don't want to hold dead things. Yes, put me down. Put me... No, I am dead. No, I am dead. Stop it, I am dead. You will stop? I am dead. Don't touch dead things. Did your mother... I am dead.
So I hope you all enjoyed that.
Hello there.
You can see why they're some of my favorite snakes. They're fantastic, and they'll stay like that until you leave them alone. They really stick to their I am dead act. So this is another one of my favorites, the garter snake. And I'm sure a lot of you, maybe if you've seen snakes, you might have seen a garter snake out. They're really colorful, really beautiful snake. And both of the pictures there of the garter snake are pictures that I took while on my field expeditions. And the top one, you can see they can they have a defense mechanism too. So they can flatten their body out, and it makes them look bigger and fatter than they are. And then they kind of flatten their head, and it kind of gives them that triangle shaped head that we associate with venomous snakes. And that's just a defense mechanism for them. The picture at the bottom, I loved. He kind of posed for me for the camera. Looks like he's smiling, very happy snake. And then the ribbon snake on the right side is often mistaken for the garter snake, but the coloration is a lot different. The garter snake, the ribbon snake doesn't have the coloration and the patterns that the garter snake does. It's basically just all solid color with a few pretty lines going down the back. And they're both non-venomous, harmless snakes. And then we have the black rat snake, which is probably my favorite snake, just because that's what I got 90% of my snake handling experience with before I went out in the field. I see them everywhere, and they're very social snakes. So you're most likely to see this out. They're not very afraid of humans. And so they will just slither right on past you and go about their business and not pay much attention to you. They are one of the longest snakes in North America. They can get up to 8 feet long, and that's amazing. Something probably most people don't know, if they feel threatened, the black rat snakes and a few other species will actually shake their tail in the leaves to make it sound like a rattle, to make it sound like, you know, they're a rattlesnake. So that's really neat. I had a person send me a video, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, I found a rattlesnake, check this out." And I was like, "No, it's actually just a black rat snake. He's just trying to freak you out." And apparently it worked. The juveniles look completely different from adults. So both the pictures you see are both black rat snakes. The one at the bottom, that's the juvenile. And so they just have that coloration. They're gray with the black spots, and they stay that way for several months. And then they fade out into this beautiful black color that you see, and they're almost completely black. They have a little bit of mottling, but you can see some little hints of the spots and the grayness underneath. And this black rat snake, I actually found this on the Thermal Belt Rail Trail when I was doing a bike ride the other day. And it was amazing. Picked it up and noticed that it is about to shed. And so that's why its eyes have that blue tint to it. So it's pretty cool. So it will all turn clear, and then it will shed off all of its skin. And then king snakes, another favorite. They're non-venomous. They're mostly black with either a white or yellow pattern. They can be seen either way. And they're about 3 to 6 foot long, not quite as long as our black rat snakes. And they're wonderful snakes to have in the yard. They will eat venomous snakes. And so, yeah, I could handle having some king snakes in the yard. And if you see one, they have this beautiful coloration. You know, please don't kill them. Please don't kill any of these snakes. They're just trying to live their best life. Another common snake that you might see is a brown snake. It's also known as a decay snake, and it's really beautiful. It has this little bit of pattern that goes down the back, but it's mostly brown. And they're pretty small. They don't really get much over a foot long at their adult stage. And on the right is the rough green snake. They're called a rough green snake actually because of the type of scales they have. They have a keel, K-E-E-L, and that's simply a raised spot in the middle of their scales that makes them appear just a little rougher. And you can have snakes that have no keel at all, or you can have snakes that are heavily keeled. A lot of the water snakes are heavily keeled, and so it gives them the appearance that they look really rough, but they're actually still pretty smooth to the touch. I love the coloration of those green snakes. The milk snake and the corn snake get confused by a lot of people. The coloration is very similar. I can always tell by the patterns on the head, and then corn snakes have more of an orangey tint most of the time. They're both harmless. They're both really nice. I was checking some cover boards not too long ago and came across that milk snake, and they're very friendly, not very likely to bite at all, and neither are corn snakes. So now I'm going to go over the venomous snakes that we do have. The first one I'm going to go over is the Eastern Diamondback Rattlesnake. They are absolutely stunning in their coloration. They are the longest rattlesnake, and they are very stocky. They're very stocky when you see them, but I absolutely love that coloration. The timber rattlesnake is just a little bit smaller in length and has different banding on it. And so it always, if anybody's seen Charlie Brown, the little tick marks on his shirt, that's what the markings on the timber rattlesnake always remind me of. And that snake, I actually took that picture. I was in Alabama, and I had stepped over a log onto a rock and looked down and saw movement, and this timber rattlesnake was crawling right past my foot. But luckily, timber rattlesnakes are not very aggressive. The Eastern Diamondbacks are, but timber rattlesnakes are very, very mild-mannered, and so it just continued along its way, and I was able to get a great picture of it. Absolutely stunning. We also have copperheads. Copperheads are probably my least favorite to work with anyway, because they're very bitey. Thankfully, their venom is not as toxic as a rattlesnake's venom, but it can still cause a lot of damage. And this picture is actually a juvenile copperhead. You can tell because it has a little green tip on its tail, and this fades out as they become adults. But if it has a green tip on its tail, that is a juvenile copperhead. And I can never mistake a copperhead for anything else. They have that very distinct head and markings. And then we also have a pygmy rattlesnake, which they're very small, and it just reminds me of like a baby timber rattlesnake, and they're not very aggressive either. And then the two that we don't have in this area, but that I'd like to show you, the Cottonmouth, and they get their name from that white on the inside of their mouth. It is super white, and you cannot mistake it for anything else. The Cottonmouth is one of the stockiest snakes I've ever seen in my life. They have very thick bodies, and so that kind of makes it stand out to me and easier to identify, because the markings are somewhat similar to some of the other snakes. And then of course we have the coral snake, very vibrant coloration, very deadly. It's actually related to the cobra, in the cobra family, and a very, very toxic venom. So you definitely don't want to mess with those. Thankfully, both of these species are just found out in coastal regions, marshy areas. And so I'll take a minute to go over some commonly misidentified snakes. I get a lot of pictures people send me, and they're like, you know, is this this? Is this? And so I want to show you a couple that are always mixed up. The northern water snake is often mistaken for a copperhead. It's also mistaken, like I said, for the cottonmouth. But the easiest way for me to tell the difference between the two, they both have kind of hourglass shaped markings on it. The thick part of that hourglass is on the spine of the northern water snake, and it's on the side of the copperhead. So the little thin part runs along the spine of the copperhead. The coloration it just seems very different to me once I've been around them a whole lot. The copperhead has that very distinct, you know, light brown and dark brown color. And your water snakes, banded water snakes, northern water snakes, they tend to be darker in color a lot of the times. So it just comes with experience. Again, if you don't know what it is, just stay far away from it and give it its space. Coral snakes and scarlet king snakes look very similar. And the only real way to tell is to look at the placement of the colors on it. So on the coral snake, the red and yellow bands touch each other. And on the scarlet king snake, the red and black touch each other. And so the saying is, red and yellow kill a fellow, red and black venom lack. And so that was what I was taught in college, and that is how I keep track of which one is which, because the scarlet king snake is actually a harmless snake and should never be confused with the coral snake. So I will take this time to answer some questions. Any questions that you have for me, and I'll see if I can get these pulled up as well.
So any questions that you have for Dana about snakes, feel free to put those in the Q&A rather than the chat. That way she can pull them up and she'll answer them that way. Yeah, go ahead and type in any questions that you have for her. So hopefully you can see the questions, Dana, if you have the Q&A opened, and there looks like there's one that popped up through the chat as well. I think if you're not screen sharing anymore, you should be able to see that now.
Okay, so I've got a couple of good questions so far. Evolutionary history of rattlesnakes. Again, not exactly a snake expert, but what I have heard is that the rattles have just evolved as, a natural defense mechanism. That way it can warn others, warn predators to stay away, things like that. All the snakes seem to develop different mechanisms as time goes on, but I'm not sure exactly why the rattlesnake got its rattles, but they are very interesting in the way they work. And yes, only venomous rattlesnakes have rattles. There are some snakes that can mimic it slightly, but they do not have a rattle. Like I said about the black rat snakes and other snakes, they will pretend to rattle and make the sound, but they don't have an actual rattle on them. There's another question about the progress of copperhead venom and breast cancer research. I actually don't have much information about that. I know that they've come a long way and they're still working towards perfecting it. But the snake venom has been helpful in so many areas of research and curing different cancers and things like that. So I think it's going to continue coming along. Oh, this is a great question. So they're saying that they've heard that a good way to tell if a snake is venomous or non-venomous is to look at the eyes. And if the pupils are split shaped, then it's venomous. And if they're round, then it is non-venomous. And that is absolutely true for the snakes in the United States. If you go outside of the United States, there's a lot of venomous snakes that have round pupils. So for our natural snakes, yes. Out of the country, never go by that. That'll come back to bite you.
Isn't that also not true of the coral snake? It doesn't have slit eyes, but it is venomous.
Oh, that is very true. That is very true.
And we had a question through the chat too. Rachel Hess asked, how did you become so interested in snakes?
Oh my gosh, I've loved snakes forever. It's probably a little bit because everyone was so afraid of them. And when I first saw them when I was young, I thought they were amazing. I thought they were beautiful colors. And, I had already picked up two, not knowing any better. And they didn't seem to want to bite me. And so I just started learning more about them. And the more I learned, the more fascinated I became. I love them. I love what they do for the ecosystem. Love the colors, and they're just really, really nice all around. being around them so much helped a lot too. Working on that farm, I mean, it was every day I was around these snakes. And so you kind of get used to them. Although I had some interesting episodes when I was working in some field jobs. So one of our jobs, we were actually doing telemetry on some field rats that we were studying. And so we had a female that we were tracking to see her little nesting habits. And it was the end of the season. It was next to last day, and I was tracking her. And when I came to the spot where the signal was coming from, it wasn't moving. And so I kind of thought maybe she slipped her collar off. And so I reached down to find it, and I grabbed a gray rat snake who had apparently eaten our test subject.
Oh, no.
Yeah, the snake and I were both very surprised, but it ran off, and but yeah, they're just amazing.
Nice. Looks like we had another question pop up on the Q&A. Katie said, I've heard that venomous snakes have a triangular head and non-venomous snakes have rounded heads. Also heard that our local timber rattlers are evolving to lose the rattles. Have you heard or seen that as well?
I actually haven't. The rattlesnakes that I've encountered, they all have had a rattle, but I have heard little talk of that, but I'm not that familiar. As far as the triangle head or the round head, it's really hard to tell sometimes because, like I said, a lot of the species, the garter snakes, things like that, they will flatten their head. The hognose snakes, they will completely change the way they look if they feel threatened. So you can't always go by that. So it's basically just doing your research. If nothing else, keep a field guide with you. They make all the waterproof field guides. They make them pretty tiny. You can keep them in a backpack, and that's a good thing to have with you if you have any questions about snakes. And if you know me personally, I am happy to answer any questions about snake ID people have. And that's just come from years of studying them.
Yes. Do you have any particular field guides that you recommend to people or that you like to use?
There is a series, and I can't think of the name of it, but they're the waterproof fold out. It's just a picture guide.
I think I know, they're like a pamphlet.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they have them for everything. They have them for snakes and turtles and owls and everything else. And I think I have every one they ever put out because they're waterproof, and it's a quick field guide. I keep them in my backpack. So it's a good reference for any of that.
Nice. Okay, we had a couple other questions pop up too. Natalie asked, how do you handle situations in which someone is afraid in the moment? Like if you're doing a hiking guide or something and you see a snake and somebody's scared.
Yeah, so if people are afraid, if there's a snake off to the side, or especially if I have it, if I've captured it to show it to people, I am never going to bring that snake anywhere near someone that is afraid. People are entitled to their fears. I'm not going to terrorize them. But I just try to explain, the good things about the snakes. And hopefully when they see me interacting with them, and that the snake is calm and everything's fine, hopefully that'll calm some of their fears. And yeah, I just try to point out, the beautiful colors and the benefits. They're eating ticks, they're eating rodents, they're cutting down on some nuisance species that we would otherwise have.
Cool. Okay, and then we had, what is the current way researchers are tracking snakes?
So there's a lot of research being done, and I actually had a job checking cover boards, and I'm helping right now check some cover boards as well. And so that's one way. They just have a whole bunch of boards set out in a particular location, and there's locations all over the United States and all over the world. And then local biologists and volunteers go out, and we check underneath these boards certain times a year and take notes and collect data on which species we're finding, how many of each. So you can get a kind of an idea of what snakes are in each area. And then those are all uploaded into a major database, and yeah, they kind of go from there.
Cool. So the cover boards, are they just a spot that the snakes are likely to go kind of get away from the heat or from predators and things like that?
Yeah, both. When you put out a cover board, you can use just a regular piece of wood or a piece of metal. If it's metal, all the better, because it's going to be warm, and the snakes are drawn. They're cold-blooded, so they're drawn to warm things to warm themselves up. And so they're likely to get underneath them to try to get warm. And if it's cool, that's a great place for them to hide. And so it just creates little places where you're more likely to find snakes.
So I had a question too. When you're out hiking now in Western North Carolina, what's the most common snake species that you typically come across?
Black rat snakes.
Yeah.
Like I said, they're the most social, and they're everywhere. They're after, you'll actually find them in trees a lot. So they climb up trees. They're egg predators too. A lot of people don't like that. But they're just doing their thing. But yeah, they'll be in trees off to the side. That black rat snake, little one that I found on the rail trail the other day, it was actually on the side of a tree near a little hole that was in the tree. So I guess it was going to go down and venture in and see what was in there. But yeah, that's the most common. And then I think the second most common, probably a tie between the garter snake and the brown snake. I get so many pictures of people that, they found garter snakes and brown snakes, and mostly with the brown snakes, they're worried it's a copperhead. So copperheads are the most common venomous snake around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've definitely spotted some of those too. We had from Katie a link shared, and I sent it to the chat, so hopefully all of you got that link as well, for an online resource for IDing snakes. So if you guys want to check out that, that's herpsofnc.org. So you guys can learn your snake ID. That way you're kind of more prepared when you go out hiking. Thanks for sharing that, Katie.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, and I had one more question. If you guys had any other questions, feel free to pop those in now. I think we're about to take a break before we get started on our next presentation. But I think most everybody in the webinar right now are familiar with this, but just in case nobody's not, you mentioned that hognose snakes can excrete a musk from their cloaca. Would you describe what the cloaca is for anyone that might not know?
Okay, yeah. So they don't have two openings like a lot of animals do. They have one single opening, and so that excretes all their waste, liquid and solid, all in one. And when they excrete this musk, it is unmistakable. It's quite a smell. And if you handle snakes a lot like I do, you end up getting that on you a good bit. That's why I always carry hand sanitizer, even before it was cool. But yeah, it's quite an overpowering smell, and they do that, it's a defense mechanism. They can do that to create a smell that kind of a dead, musky smell. It's not great, but it will wash off.
Good, that's good to know. Okay, well, we haven't had any more questions pop up. So we'll just take about a 12-minute break. We'll get started again at 11. Our next speaker, Katherine Etchison, is in another webinar right now. So she's gonna hop off that and then join us immediately. So hopefully she'll be able to hop off and join us by 11. So feel free to take a bathroom break, get a snack, but stay on the webinar, but feel free to walk away from your computer and be back at 11. And we'll be back for our bats. Yeah, virtual clap for our great presentation. So thank you, Dana. Thank you so much. Awesome. So everybody take a bit of a break, come back at 11, and we'll get started on bats.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Katherine has joined us, and she will be presenting on bats today. Katherine has been a wildlife diversity biologist with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission since 2015. She conducts surveys for rare and threatened bats and monitors populations of these and other mammal species. So here to present is Katherine.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Kalia. Let me know if you are seeing my first slide. Did that come up?
You're perfect.
Yes. Okay, great. Hey, everybody out there. This is the first time I've done one of these virtual presentations, so bear with me. But I want to thank Kalia and Anna and their group for having me today. This is really fun to be able to present in this way during these times and make it work, so I'm happy to be here. Please pardon my dogs if they bark. Hopefully they won't, but I set them up with some treats, so hopefully they'll be quiet and let us cover this. So with that, I just want to kind of dive right into it. This will be a presentation on bat conservation here in North Carolina. And we'll start with just the basics about bats and then move into white nose syndrome, which is a disease that's affecting bats. And then we'll talk about some monitoring efforts that our agency is doing. And then we'll finish up with how all of you can help. Okay, jump right in. So the first thing I like to start with is to address those myths that we've all heard. Because I think this creates some confusion about what's true, what's false about bats. So I like to just clear the slate up front. So we'll address kind of some of those most popular myths. The first one is that bats are blind. And I'm betting every single one of us have heard that phrase, blind as a bat, right? So what is the deal? Are bats really blind? No, they're not actually. They can see just as well as we can see, but they do rely more on their sense of echolocation. And if you think this through, it really makes sense because if you think about our own eyesight at night in total darkness, not a street light, not a house light on, and if we're trying to eat all of our food in that time period like bats do because they're nocturnal, we wouldn't do so well. We'd probably not make it, right? So that's why bats have developed this sense of echolocation because they're able to then get more information about their surroundings than they would be with just their eyesight alone. So that's that first myth busted. The second one is that all bats carry rabies. I hear this quite a bit when I tell people that I'm a bat biologist and they like kind of take a step away from me and they say, aren't you really concerned about rabies? Well, for one, anyone who works with bats needs to have their rabies pre-exposure vaccines. So we take precautions anyway, but not every single bat that you see flying in the sky at night has rabies. So it's actually only about 3% of the bats tested in North Carolina that come up positive for rabies. And I want to emphasize that word tested there. So these bats were already displaying some odd behavior that got them tested in the first place, like being in human dwellings. So it's estimated that less than 1% of wild bats are actually positive for rabies. So it's still a very serious thing, and you don't ever want to handle bats if you don't have a vaccine that's current. We definitely don't tell people to go out and do that, but don't be fearful of bats because you think 100% of bats have rabies. Oh, this is a fun one. Some people think that bats get tangled in your hair or make nests in your hair, but this one's just totally false. Bats don't make nests, for one, and they don't seek to get in your hair. I think where this comes from is if you're standing or sitting outside at night, you're frequently kind of swatting at mosquitoes or other insects, and that's what bats eat. So all of our bats here in North Carolina eat insects, they eat mosquitoes, and so they may get near you because they're zooming after a bug, but they're not trying to get in your hair or interact with you. I like to tell people that if this were the case, I would not spend basically my entire summer while everyone else is having so much fun and going to the beach and doing all this, setting up these giant nets every single night to catch bats, which takes a ton of time, a ton of effort. I would go outside my door, I would tease up my hair as high as possible. I'd get a lot of volunteers that have really big hair, and that's how we would catch bats, but that doesn't actually work. I've never had a bat in my hair. So yeah, false. Another myth is that all bats suck blood. This has become really popular in recent years with the popularization of vampire bats and vampire kind of everything. And really there's only 3 species of vampire bats, and they occur in Central and South America. So not here, not really a concern. They primarily feed on livestock, And out of all bats on Earth, you know, there's only 3 species of vampire bats, so not many. Bats are just mice with wings. This is one I could kind of see the reasoning behind, because they kind of look mouse-like. They're brown, they're furry, they're small. But what's interesting is they're actually more closely related to primates than to rodents. So they're not mice, they're not even rodents. And they tend to be really different as far as they tend to have a really long lifespan, and most rodents don't. And they tend to reproduce really slowly, kind of like we do, and most rodents don't. So now that we've kind of wiped out all of that maybe lingering false information from those myths, I want to build on your basic knowledge of bats. So the first thing to know about bats, which you guys probably all know this anyway, but it's worth reiterating because it makes them really unique, is that bats are the only flying mammal. Sometimes I run across people and they think they're actually birds, which is funny, but they're not. They fly, you know, just like birds, they fly, but they're mammals. And some people think, well, what about flying squirrels? You know, it's in the name, flying. Well, I think that that's kind of a misnomer for squirrels. They're really like a gliding squirrel. They tend to leap off from a high point, like a high point on a tree, and glide to a lower point. So they can't actually achieve sustained flight like a bat can. So bats are the only ones that can do that, and they're the only flying mammal. Bats are in the order Chiroptera, and this translates, I think in Greek, to mean hand wing, which is actually a really fitting name for them. So if you look at the photo in this slide, to kind of orient you, right above the word, or the M in mammal, you see a little appendage sticking up. That's actually the thumb on that bat's left hand, basically. And that hand makes up basically all of that wing. So you see the thumb, and then coming straight down from that is the pinky finger. And then kind of the other 3 fingers are between those 2. So they actually, because they're mammals like we are, they have the same bones in their arms that we do, but they're just in way different proportions. So the bones of their fingers are very elongated. The bones of the upper arm are reduced, and that's why they're called Chiroptera, because they're flying basically with their hands as their wings. And this order, Chiroptera, the bats, is the second largest group of mammals. I think before I started working with bats, I didn't really think about bats as being that numerous, but they actually are. They make up 20 to 25% of all mammals. And there are over 1,400 species of bats worldwide. That's why I said, you know, 3 species of vampire bats, not that big of a deal, when there's over 1,400 species of bats worldwide. And then in the US, we have 47 species. And here in North Carolina, we have 17. And we're going to get into some of those 17 and talk about how they're doing, some of the kind of more rare species. But before we do that, I kind of want to circle back to today's topic. And the title of today's program is Feared Friends, which I think is really fitting because certainly many people have fears about bats. And I just want to, you know, prompt you to think about, are bats really scary, or have we just kind of made them out to be scary? We've given them this undeserved reputation as being scary, as being this poster child for Halloween, right? But they're really not scary. And what I would argue is scarier than bats themselves is the threats that they're currently under, and the population declines that we're seeing, and how rare some of our bats have become in recent years. I think that's what's really scary, and I would hope that that's kind of the message you would take home with you today. So we'll talk about some of those species that occur here in North Carolina and how they're doing. So we'll start with kind of the most rare ones, which are our endangered bats. And endangered just means at risk of being extinct. So in North Carolina, we have 3 endangered species of bat, and these first 2 are the Indiana bat and the gray bat. And you'll see I've put like a little red outline around those pictures, which just means that these 2 species are susceptible to a disease called white nose syndrome. And we'll go totally into that in just a few slides. The Indiana bat and the gray bat, were both listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the endangered species list a while ago now. So the Indiana bat was listed in the 60s. It was one of the very first species to be listed. And then the gray bat was listed shortly after in the 70s. And both of these bats were listed because they had become very rare from basically human disturbance to the caves that they hibernate in. And in the case of the gray bat, that species uses caves year round. So also the caves that they spend their summer in too. And so they were rare to begin with. And then in 2006, this disease showed up, white nose syndrome. So it's kind of added insult to injury. So both of these bats are still listed and still rare. There have been some successful efforts to put gates on the caves that they use and really moderate human access to those caves. So that has been really good for both of those species, but still rare for now. Then we have the Virginia big-eared bat. This species was also listed in the 70s, and you'll notice there's not a red outline around this bat, which is good. That means they are not susceptible to white nose syndrome. We don't know exactly why that is. They tend to be in caves with other species that do get the disease and have the disease, but for whatever reason, this species doesn't get it. So that's really good news. And they tend to be pretty stable here in North Carolina. We have a pretty small population of this bat, but they appear to be stable. Okay, moving into our threatened bats of North Carolina. Threatened is just a designation that's one step down from endangered. So instead of being at risk of going extinct, it's at risk of becoming endangered. And we just have one species that's federally listed as threatened, and that's the northern long-eared bat. And this species was actually just listed in 2015, so not that long ago, and it was listed because of population declines from white nose syndrome. So contrary to those first few we went through, which were listed a while ago, this one was pretty common before white nose syndrome came on the scene. And then we have the raffinose big-eared bat, and this one is state threatened. So it's listed at a state level and not at a federal level, which is good. It means across the whole population of this species, or the whole range of this species, that it's not warranted to be listed at a federal level. So we just have it listed at a state level, and they tend to be pretty stable as well, and also not susceptible to white nose syndrome. Okay, now moving to our special concern bats, and that's a state designation, so this isn't at a federal level. This just means these bats are rare and we have some kind of knowledge gaps, and so we're watching them closely. And this is we have the eastern small-footed bat and the southeastern bat. Now, both of these are susceptible to white nose syndrome as well, though they don't appear to be quite as vulnerable to the disease or impacted by the disease as some other species. And luckily for us here in North Carolina, the southeastern bat actually occurs on the coastal plain of North Carolina, and we have not seen the disease appear there at this point. And so they are free from impacts from that disease in North Carolina. The eastern small-footed bat, I'll kind of take you through some data for this species later. We don't know exactly how they're doing from white nose syndrome. We kind of have conflicting data. Some of our data show that they're doing okay. Some of our data show that they're declining. So it's kind of hard to tell for that species. And then finally, we have our at-risk bats. Now, these two species are under review by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to potentially be listed. So we will know more in the coming years about whether the Fish and Wildlife Service decides that a listing is warranted for these two species, the little brown bat and the tricolor bat. Both of these are susceptible to white nose syndrome and used to be very common and abundant before this disease came to the U.S. And now they've become very, very rare, especially the little brown bat here in North Carolina. And that's why the Fish and Wildlife Service is reviewing them for listing. So we'll now talk about white nose syndrome, the thing that I've mentioned a bunch at this point but haven't quite defined, and a lot of you out there are probably familiar with this and know what this is, but if not, we're going to break it down, and at least you'll maybe learn some more that you didn't know if you already knew about this. So white nose syndrome is a fungal disease, and it is native to Europe or Asia. It's caused by this fungus called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, or just abbreviated PD because that's a long name. And this was first discovered back in New York State, or back in 2006 in New York State, which if you're paying close attention, it would be confusing because we know it's native to Europe or Asia, but it was discovered in New York, so that doesn't really align. Well, this wasn't known. This disease, this fungus was not known. It wasn't on anyone's radar. And then in 2006, biologists were doing their routine cave surveys, counting all of their bats, and they started seeing this white fungus appear on these bats, just like you see in this photo, and didn't know what that was. And then soon after started seeing mortality of bats. And so at that point, people were scrambling to try to find the answers and see what this was. And in the years after this first discovery, scientists later figured out that this fungus is actually present in Europe and Asia in caves there. And we think that's where it originally came from, but it just wasn't known to science until it showed up in the US in New York State back in 2006. Since then, it has spread to 34 states in the US and then 7 provinces in Canada, and it first got here in 2011. And primarily the bats spread it themselves. These fungal spores are really hardy, they're microscopic, they tend to kind of stick into fur, and so it's really easy for the bats to spread this around. But we can also spread it too, so we have to take a lot of precautions to make sure we decontaminate all of our survey equipment after every single survey to make sure we're not adding to that and spreading this disease. And unfortunately, this has caused mass mortality of bats in North America. And the way that this works is this fungus is a cold-loving fungus. It thrives in cold, humid, dark conditions. And those are the places that bats hibernate in for the winter. So bats hibernate usually in caves or underground mines, and those kind of tick all those boxes as far as those characteristics that this fungus thrives in. And bats, when they're hibernating, they bring their body temperatures down to within about 1 degree of that ambient temperature in the cave. And so they're physically cold enough for this fungus to be able to grow on. And then the bats sense that this thing is growing on them because it irritates their skin, and they wake up and then clean themselves off. And if they could do that all winter long with no consequences, they would probably be fine. But the problem is the whole reason they're hibernating is because there aren't enough food resources out on the landscape for them, not enough insects to eat. And so every time they wake up, they burn through a portion of the fat reserves that they've saved up to last the whole winter. And eventually they just burn through all of them and starve to death. So it's a nasty disease. There are a couple other ways this fungus can kill them too. It can just kill them outright by penetrating into their tissues and disrupting physiological function. But so far, as we know, bats are kind of the perfect host for this, and they're the only host that we know of. There are 13 different species that can get this disease, and we have 8 of them in North Carolina. And there could be more out there that can get this disease as well. So kind of every year we see the disease moving westward across the US. And so as it comes into contact with certain bats that are out west that we don't have in the east, we might learn more about other species that are susceptible. So here's a look at everywhere we know the disease, white nose syndrome, or the fungus that causes the disease is in the US and in Canada. And we want to look at North Carolina specifically. These are the counties where we have found either the fungus that causes the disease by simply swabbing bats and sending that to a lab for testing, or finding a dead bat and sending that off for testing. What's kind of misleading here is from our surveys and monitoring that we do, we see population declines throughout the whole mountain region, not just those particular counties that are highlighted there. And so we think white nose is present throughout the mountains in North Carolina, but we just don't have a cave that we survey in every single mountain county to be able to test for white nose or the fungus that causes it. So, so to kind of just assume that that's all positive, because we do see declines across the mountain region. And then you'll notice we have found the fungus that causes this disease even in the Piedmont portion of the state now. The good news is we don't see mortalities in the Piedmont region of the state. We haven't seen any mortalities, and we definitely have seen big declines here, but in the Piedmont, we haven't seen that, so that's good. Okay, now I just want to talk to you a little bit about some bat monitoring that our agency is doing, and kind of some results from each of those methods. So we're going to talk about our hibernaculous surveys, our mist netting surveys, roost surveys, and then the acoustic monitoring that we do. Okay, so we'll start with those hibernaculous surveys. And a hibernaculum is simply a place where an animal hibernates, and for bats that tends to be caves and underground mines like we mentioned, and actually root cellars too. This year we found a few bats hibernating in root cellars, so that was kind of cool. So what we do for these surveys, we just simply go into caves and mines in the wintertime, so usually December to early March, and we count all the bats that we see. We record what species they are and whether they have signs of white nose syndrome. Excuse me, I have some allergies today. And this allows us to, over time, if we go to the same sites, either every other year, every few years, we're able to get a sense of whether species that hibernate at that site are increasing, whether they're decreasing, or appear to be stable. And this allows us to develop some population trends, which is really helpful for the work that we do to understand whether these rare bats or bats that we're concerned about their populations are growing, which is great, which is a lot of times unfortunately not the case, or whether they're decreasing or tend to be stable. And if we do enough of these surveys across a region or across the state, we're able to get a really good sense of, across that mountain region or across the whole state, how a certain species is doing. This also allows us to track the spread of white nose syndrome and to figure out where that is in our state as well. Either we see the signs of fungal growth on the bats, or we take these fungal swabs. It's basically like a cotton swab, like a Q-tip or something, and we just simply rub it across the bat's muzzle and across one of its forearms, and we can send that off for testing. And even if we don't see signs of fungal growth on that bat, we can know that the fungus is present from doing those kinds of fungal tests. So I have some results or some data to share with you today to get a sense of what we're seeing with these surveys, what kind of results we're seeing from the surveys. So this is data from our hibernacula counts from 2010 to now. And this is just at our long-term sites that we survey, periodically every few years. And this is just for bats that are susceptible to white nose syndrome. So not all bats, just the subset of those that get the disease. And if you look closely, you can see in 2010, we counted close to 6,000 bats that winter. And then the next year in 2011, white nose syndrome was found in North Carolina. And then we had a really big drop off in our counts of bats all the way till 2015. And then at that point, we've had kind of a leveling off at a really low number of bats, but it has never gone down to zero, even if it might appear that way. It hasn't. That map is, or that graph is kind of small. We've always had some bats, even if it's just a few, And the really cool thing is this year in 2020, for the first time ever, we have seen a little bit of growth in that line, a little bit of growth in our counts. And so we were really encouraged to see that. Honestly, didn't really expect to see that. Not sure at this point whether that could be a product of bats moving from several different places into just a few different hibernacula, or what I'm more hopeful is that it's survivors that we've been seeing and they're reproducing, and this is a product of that. So with more years of surveys, we'll get a better handle on what this is from and what it could be attributed to, and hopefully that line will continue to have that uptick, and maybe very, very, very slowly we could see some of these bat populations recover. So that was really good news. If we, overall though, Debbie Downer, it is a 95% decrease, unfortunately. But if we break it out by species, these are 5 species that we commonly see hibernating in North Carolina, Western North Carolina. And if we look at the change that we've seen in our hibernating populations of these bats, it's pretty stark. So for little brown bats, I don't know if you guys can see that, we've had almost a 97% decline. For tricolored bats, it's been about 95%, and northern long-eared bats, 100%. So those are the biggies. Those are the biggest population declines we've seen. And then for big browns and small-footed bats, those look like more modest declines in this figure, but still substantial. But I think for those 2 species, the good news, I think, is that's actually even overstated. I think the declines are probably less for both of those bats, but this survey method is a little bit biased because for those 2 bats, because they don't tend to hibernate only in caves and mines. Like some of these other bats are kind of more restricted to that kind of environment for their hibernating ecology. Big browns sometimes use people's attics. They can use rock outcrops. Small-footed bats use rock outcrops. If they can get kind of far enough back in a cliff face, they'll do that. So so take those two percentages with a grain of salt. But I think for little browns, tricolored, and northern long-eared bats, that's probably pretty accurate. And you'll see with some of our other results that it's in agreement with some of our other survey methods. So moving into those other survey methods, we have our misnetting surveys. So these are fun surveys. We do these oftentimes in the summertime, and we go out and we set up these great big nets. It's, like I said earlier, very time intensive and labor intensive, but totally worth it to see these bats up close. And these nets are kind of like big volleyball nets, if you imagine that. They're also the same kind of mist nets that are used for bird mist netting. If you've ever seen that or done that, we use the same nets, but we set them up at a different time of day. So we set them up at sunset, and we catch bats for usually 4 to 5 hours. We check these nets every 8 to 10 minutes, and we get the bats out. We take them over to like a kind of central processing area. We record what species they are, whether they're male or female, whether they're reproductive, their age, and then we put a little band on them typically, and it's like a little metal band that goes on their forearm, and it has a unique letter and number code. So if we ever caught that bat again, we would be able to look in our database and see the first place that we caught it and how old that bat was and all the different measurements we took on it, which is really cool. So you get some kind of life history information when you recapture these bats. You could get movement information too. So that's a pretty fun thing to do, and it's really fun when you recapture one of these bats. It doesn't happen that often, but it's pretty cool. So we surveyed 25 to 30 sites across the state using this kind of survey. And just like our hibernacula surveys, we're looking for that population trend information. So we go to the same sites either year after year or every other year, and we're trying to get a sense of whether certain species are increasing or decreasing or stable. We're also looking for certain species presence sometimes. So sometimes we have questions about whether a certain rare species occurs in a certain county, and it might be in adjacent counties, and so we think, it could probably be in that county, but this is a good method to kind of confirm that. So we can set up a bunch of nets in a place we think we'd be likely to catch that species, and then when you do catch it, it's really satisfactory because you get to, or satisfying because you get to confirm that that rare bat is actually there. Kind of the downside is if you don't catch it, you can't say it's not there because you could have just missed it. Bats can pretty easily fly around our nets, and we get a lot of holes in our nets from these bats chewing on them, so they can even fly through our net sometimes if they want. So yeah, it's a good survey method, but like all survey methods, it has kind of some flaws or some biases. So we have some results from this survey method as well. And so this is just what we've seen since white-nose came on the scene as far as increases or decreases for certain species. And we have 6 species in this graph because we've added the Indiana bat. We don't often see bat species hibernating in North Carolina, but they tend to be around in the summertime, so they can be caught in mist nets, and so they're added to this graph. You'll see for species like the little brown, northern long-eared bat, and tricolored bat, we've seen pretty big declines for those species, just like we have for our hibernaculous surveys. And also for Indiana bats, we've seen a big decline in our misnetting captures for that species. But then look at the big brown and the eastern small-footed on the left. Like I said, I think those hibernaculous survey estimates were kind of overstated for these 2 bats. Big browns, I think this is more accurate, that they've probably declined a little bit, but not a whole lot. So maybe 8% could be fitting for them. You'll see small-footed bats, we've actually increased our captures of small-footed bats 91%, which is crazy, since white-nose came on the scene. And like I mentioned about this species earlier, we don't totally know what's going on with them. So it's encouraging to see that we've caught more of them, but I don't have a good sense of why that is, whether before there weren't a lot of captures for that species and there were a lot of captures for these others that have declined, like little browns especially. So maybe we were kind of missing them because we were catching so many of these other bats, you know, I don't know. And so now we catch them because we don't catch much else, or whether their populations are actually increasing. Not really sure at this point, but trying to gather more data on that species to kind of better understand what's going on with them. And now moving into our roost surveys. So in the summertime, bats will group up together. Certain species, not all species, but our most social species will group up together and form colonies. And most of the time, this is the females will group up together and form what's called a maternity colony, and they'll have all their pups around the same time. And so what we'll do is we'll go to places where we know bats roost, and we will count all of them, either once or multiple times over the summer. And again, this helps us get that really valuable population trend information. So some of these are bat houses. Some of these are bridges or other man-made structures. And one is a cave. Most bats don't roost in caves in the summertime, but a few do. So this is just another way for us to kind of figure out how bats are doing. Like I said, all survey methods have their own biases, and so if you can do more types of surveys, you get kind of a better picture of how all of these bats are doing. And we don't have a ton of data to share for our roost surveys because we can't monitor all species this way, simply because we don't know where all these bats roost. And some bats roost individually. Some bats don't roost in a group like this. So what we do have to share is, you can see, unfortunately, again, little brown bats have a really large decline, just like our hibernaculous surveys show and our misnetting surveys show. So we've seen about a 95% decline in that species. And in fact, the roosts that we knew about, we haven't seen a single little brown at, I think, since 2014. So they've kind of just been wiped out at those roosts. And then we've actually had an increase in our big brown bats at the places where we know they roost. So that's encouraging to see. That species does not seem to be quite as affected by this disease as some of the others. And then again, kind of the enigma here, the eastern small-footed bat. We see a decline for them with our roost surveys. But I'll say we only have 2 roosts that we survey for this bat, or that we monitor, because we just don't know of many more than that. We're adding 1 additional roost that we did find out about. But when you just have 2 roosts that you monitor, it can be kind of misleading when one of them has a decline, which is what we've seen. One of the roosts is stable. The other roost has seen a decline, but it could just be a factor from disturbance, and that they've found other roosts in the area that are actually better and have less disturbance, and it's maybe not a product of white nose syndrome decline. So again, still looking for more information on that species. And finally, our acoustic monitoring that we do. So we have a citizen science program, and we ask volunteers to help us collect some bat acoustic information. So they drive 20-mile routes with a bat detector on the roof of their vehicle. And the whole time that they're driving, they have to drive at 20 miles an hour, which is harder than it sounds. They're recording bat echolocation calls. And then what's neat is we can take that bat detector and take the SD card out of it and download all the calls, and you can actually tell species apart by their calls and the shapes of their calls. And so that's a really useful tool, because we don't even have to touch the bats. It's not invasive at all. We're not disturbing them. And then we can engage citizen scientists too. So that program started in Western North Carolina, and now it has expanded and kind of evolved to a statewide program. But what I have are the results from the kind of early effort here in Western North Carolina. Again, we get some population trend information out of this. You're going to get sick of hearing that. So here are the results that I mentioned. So to kind of orient you here, this is going to be just in Western North Carolina, and just for 1 species, the tricolored bat. And what you see is obviously a map of Western North Carolina, and then it has a bunch of black squiggly lines all over it. Those are the driving transects, and they're just mapped out. And then if there's a point over top of that transect, it just means that it was surveyed that year. So the transects that don't have a point were just not driven that year. And then the larger and darker the point is, the more tricolored bat calls that were recorded. The smaller and lighter colored, the less tricolored bat calls that were recorded. So just take a mental image, nothing fancy, just kind of take mental stock of this map, and then you'll see how it changed with each year. So this is in 2011, and then 2012, not a whole lot different. 2013, starting to see some big changes. 14, even bigger. 15, yeah, very, very few calls. 16, and then 17 kind of looks the same. So as kind of a reminder from beginning to end, what we saw with this species, again, just really pronounced decreases in the numbers of these calls, and in general in this species here in Western North Carolina, kind of no matter what survey method you're using. I know that it's all kind of doom and gloom with this white nose stuff, so I want to transition to some more hopeful things. But hopefully that hit home that, you know, some of our species have declined pretty severely, and so we want to really pay attention to bats and help bats as much as we can. But like I said, there are some hopeful things, and so you have to, with working with bats nowadays, you have to be able to find the silver lining, because it's hard sometimes. But the good news is some of these bat species that are really susceptible to white nose syndrome, and we've seen big population declines in Western North Carolina. Sorry, there go my dogs if you hear them. they must see a bear. There was a bear outside our house this morning. Go figure. For this presentation today, there's a bear. But anyway, so some of our bats that are susceptible to white nose syndrome, and we've seen big declines here in the mountains, actually occur on the coastal plain in North Carolina too, which is great because that is an area where we haven't seen white nose syndrome yet, and we're hopeful, those are the 3 species, we're hopeful if it ever does get there that we wouldn't see the major infections and the major mortality that we see in Western North Carolina. And the reason being is bats are pretty active in the winter time on the coastal plain. There are enough insects for them to eat during the winter that they don't have to hibernate for really long periods of time like they do here in the mountains. And so that could enable them to fight off a white nose syndrome infection if that fungus ever gets there and if the disease develops. Hopefully they would be able to fight it off. And in case you didn't see it, the 3 species that we know occur there that we also have up here that have declined are the tricolored bat, the northern long-eared bat, and the little brown bat. And those are the ones that are really doing worse, or the worst here in the mountains. And so we have some hope that they will persist on the coastal plain. But even up here in the mountains, I have some hope for our bats, and especially with our new 2020 hibernacula data, have even more hope because we do have some survivors. So that line never went all the way down to 0, if you'll remember. So we know that these bats are still around. We don't understand exactly what the mechanism is that's keeping them alive, whether it's resistance or tolerance or something else altogether, but we'll take it. Whatever it is that's keeping these bats alive is great to see, and we hope that we will see these survivors reproducing and, you know, maybe a slow recovery with these bats. But with all that said, there are some other issues too. White nose, unfortunately, is not the only factor that affects these bats and that threatens these bats. Wind energy is another concern, and it's not as much of a concern for the species that are affected by white nose. It's more of a concern for our migratory bats. So if bats aren't hibernating in the winter, they migrate to somewhere else that has insect abundance all year, or at least in the winter. And so those species are the ones that tend to be susceptible to impacts and collisions with wind turbines. So just something to think about. The good news is there's a lot of research right now to try to figure that out. So I'm more hopeful that a solution could be reached more easily for that situation. It's certainly being researched, and there are some mitigation techniques coming out. So that's good, but just to kind of make you aware. Another big issue for bats, and that's kind of why we're sitting here today, is just people have a fear of them, and it's usually from some misunderstanding or some of that mythical information we talked about earlier. But that is why education is the key. And really, this one gives me great hope because it's something that all of us can work on. You don't have to be a biologist. You don't have to really be a person who loves bats. You can just be someone who knows a thing or two about bats, and you can help educate others. So that's what I want to kind of spend the rest of this on today, is talking about how everybody on this call and other people can help bats. So the biggest thing is to just be a bat ambassador, right? So like, dispel those myths when you hear them. Maybe tactfully tell someone, oh, you know, that's actually a myth, that's not true, and here's the factual information. Give people the tools to understand bats using facts and using information, and not kind of this folklore, right? So that's a really good thing you can do. Another good thing is to just educate people, your friends, your family, on the benefits of bats. And there are a lot of them. I've listed a few today, but there are plenty more out there. So I'd encourage you to do some Googling, and maybe you have a lot of spare time right now, like some of us do, and learn more about the benefits of bats. But a few of those to get you started Our pest control is a big one here. So all of our bats eat insects, and they don't just like eat a couple insects, they eat a lot of insects. So a bat can eat its body weight in insects in a single night in the summertime, which is kind of crazy if you really think about that, and you think about eating your body weight in something, which might be something that we think we're doing right now in quarantine, but you're not eating your body weight. So, but bats can do that. That's pretty crazy. So they're eating a lot of insects. There was a study done a few years ago, and they estimated that bats save the corn industry over $3 billion a year in pesticide applications. So that's really awesome. While you're sleeping at night, you don't even realize that bats are doing this great service and keeping our insect populations in check. So that's a pretty cool thing that they do. In other parts of the world, bats act as pollinators. So not here in North Carolina specifically, but in other places, they're a pollinator of a lot of key crops, bananas, mangoes, actually the agave plant. So if you are a fan of agave nectar or even tequila, you have bats to thank for that. They're actually the only pollinator of the agave plant, so that's pretty cool. You can even get, I think, bat-friendly tequila nowadays, where bat biologists have worked with farmers to make sure that bats are kind of essential in that process, because you can kind of keep the bats out of that process by sort of cloning your agave plants and not allowing them to flower. But the crop is more robust and diverse and sort of stronger, healthier in terms of disease if you let it flower and let it produce naturally, and then that's good for the bats. So anyway, that's a pretty cool story. You should look that up while you're in quarantine. And then bats can even be used for medicinal purposes, not to consume them, but in a lab setting. The enzyme that's used in the vampire bat's saliva can be used for stroke victims for their medication as an anticoagulant. So this can be like synthesized in a lab setting. It doesn't come straight from the bat, but that is the original inspiration for this. So that's pretty cool. So other ways that you guys can help are to build a bat house, which is a really good thing to do, especially if you have some time on your hands right now. I would recommend going to the Bat Conservation International website. It's batcon.org, and they have awesome resources for all things bats, and they have a really good section on bat houses. So whether you wanted to build your own, they have plans for that, or if you just want to buy one, they have different websites that you can go to do that. And they have a lot of good information on how to install a bat house, which is key because bats can be really picky. So you want to install it kind of with a lot of things in mind that'll attract the bats or that'll make them the most comfortable. And yep, said that. And to get you started, I'll just kind of finish up with a few bat box tips if you want to put up one of those. Try to either build one or buy one that has multiple chambers or multiple compartments. That is kind of best for attracting one of those maternity colonies because a lot of times they need a lot of space. And try to get it at least 12 feet off the ground, but the closer to 20 feet you can get it, the better. They like to just be kind of nice and high up, away from predators, and that gives them some room for when they first come out. They kind of drop first and then they take flight, so they kind of need some room for that. And if possible, avoid mounting the bat house on a tree. This is simply because the upper limbs on a tree can sort of shade out the box. The bats like to be nice and warm and get a lot of sunlight, so that can be too shady for them, and they also can be more vulnerable to predators if it's on a tree, so like raccoons and snakes can get up in there. So kind of the best option is to put it on a pole. The second best option would be to put it on a building. And if you don't have either of those options, it's still great to put up a bat house, so then put it up on a tree if that's all you got. And try to put it in a place that gets a lot of sunlight, especially in the morning. They like to be really nice and warm during the first part of the day. So 6 to 8 hours a day would be great of sun, but especially in the morning. And if you have a water source on your property, try to put the bat house near that water source. One of the first things they're going to do when they come out at night is to drink water. But if you don't have something like that, not a problem, still put up the bat house. And here in Western North Carolina, you would want to paint the outside of that bat house a medium to a dark brown color to just really soak in that sunlight. If you're in another place, you should look at the Bat Conservation International website, and they have instructions as far as what color to paint your bat house based on where you are. And the final thing for today, another way to help, if you guys know of a cave or a mine or even a root cellar, it's on maybe your property or a family member's, and you think we could survey that for bats, let us know, because we are always in need of more survey sites. So my email address is here, and I would love to hear from you. And I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Yeah. So if anyone has questions for Katherine about bats, put them in the Q&A, and then she'll be able to go through them and answer any of those.
I don't see any questions yet, but I gotta thank you. Thank you.
And if you should see the Q&A at the bottom.
Oh.
And also read the questions to you if you'd like. Whichever.
Oh, here we go. How do we volunteer to band bats is my first question. Well, so banding is something we do with our summer mist netting. And we don't have, like, all of our sites aren't really accessible for volunteers, but a few of them are great for volunteers, and we're happy to have volunteers out with us. So I would say the best thing to do would be to email me. So maybe I should put my email back up, huh?
You can also put your email in the chat if you do to all attendees.
Oh, yes.
And everyone can see it.
That's so helpful. Here's my email. Yeah, so just email me and we'll go from there as far as volunteering. There's my email. Did I just send it to you? Or how do I send it to everyone?
Send it to everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm technologically challenged. Okay. Yes, my second question is, how are the mist nets designed to not harm bats? That's a good question too. So these mist nets are made of this really delicate filament. So they're like really lightweight little threads. They actually rip very easily too. And so when the bats run into them, they hit them, and then the mist nets have like a little pocket in them. Each kind of, I'm not explaining this well. They have like 5 different pockets going down the mist net. And so the bat will just simply kind of land in that pocket. And sometimes they sort of twirl around and they get sort of caught in there. And so we have to kind of extract them bit by bit, but they tend to not get injured. They're not in there for very long. So I check my nets every 8 minutes. And so that's a lot. You go check your nets, you sit down, you get a tiny drink of water, and you're back up and checking your nets again. So the bats never have enough time to be in there to wrap themselves up enough to hurt themselves. And then the mist nets are so lightweight, and bats are pretty robust little guys. Like they're pretty, they wouldn't really get hurt from just flying into a mist net. And they sense them too. So unfortunately, we would like to think like, oh, they don't even know our mist nets are there, and they just run right into them. They only run into them because they can't get around them. So we have to put them in places where there are enough branches and vegetation on either side of our net and over the top of our net that the bats don't really have an option. They can't go around them. So they know before they're about to hit it, they're like, oh, so they're not probably going like full speed. But yeah, good question. My next question is, what do you do if you find a bat outside your house? Yeah, so that happens a lot. I get a lot of calls, especially in the summertime, and people find bats either on the ground outside of their house, or they find them maybe roosting in the eaves of their house, that kind of thing. For me, you're welcome to contact me if you have. It kind of varies case by case of what you find. whether like a bat is injured or whether it's just grounded and just needs kind of to be placed up on a high spot on a tree, and then can kind of rest and take off later. So it kind of varies case by case. So I would recommend just calling our agency. So you can call me, but a lot of times in the summer I'm in the field, or I'm nocturnal with the bats in the summer, so I'm not always available. But we have a wildlife helpline, the Wildlife Commission does. And so they're super great because they get questions all the time and they know exactly what to tell you guys. So that would be my recommendation, really, is to call our wildlife helpline. And I'm happy to pass on that information to Anna, and maybe Anna, you could get that out to the group. And they're good for, if you find any animal, you know, you can ask them. We also have wildlife rehabilitators in North Carolina that can be permitted for bat rehab. So if you would find a bat that's injured, we used to not have that in North Carolina, and this is the first year that we do. So that's an option nowadays too. So that's really great. So yeah, it's kind of case by case. We're working on our website to have those very specific scenarios addressed, so that even if you couldn't get a hold of somebody, you could find really good information online depending on what your scenario is. My next question is, are there certain types of paints to avoid while painting a bat house? I don't know the answer to that question. Typically, all questions about bat houses, I send like all the information for Bat Conservation International to someone and just say like, run with it, enjoy. I don't know of a paint that you shouldn't use while painting a bat house, but that is a good question that, yeah, I would go to the Bat Conservation International website and their bat house resources, because if there is, it would be addressed in there. Can you tell us about bat ticks? Yeah, sometimes we do see, well, we see all sorts of little parasites on bats. Sometimes just little mites. They can get ticks. Sometimes they have these spider things that are interesting. They get bat bugs, which are closely related to bed bugs. So we see kind of all manner of those on bats. It seems kind of like certain species we find parasites on more. So like the bats that roost in colonies, it seems like we find more of a parasite load on those. Personally, like I don't do much more than like pull those off of the bat that I'm handling, and then I let them go. We've had some researchers that want us to collect those, so we have collected like the bat spiders sometimes. But there's not a lot more that I know about those other than, yeah, we find them. I try to remove them for the bat to make it more comfortable and then let it go. I try to not like get them on me. But yeah, they definitely are susceptible to that. And I think their nature of roosting in colonies probably helps spread that, unfortunately. Let's see, I'm gonna scroll down and have one more question. Oh, this is a good question. Are there any treatments for white nose syndrome that seem promising? I've heard of UV or bacterial treatments being looked at, but nothing about how successful they've been. Yeah, that is a really good question. So there has been, and still is, a lot of work by researchers on treatments for white nose syndrome. And UV is certainly one that has had really promising results in a lab setting. UVC light can kill the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. And last I heard, there were field trials that were going on to kind of figure out, like a lot of these treatments, how to actually implement it in real life where bats are in caves and mines, because a lot of these treatments work really well in a lab setting. I'm not a microbiologist, but what I've heard from other microbiologists is that this fungus is not hard to kill. Kind of the hard thing is to get whatever mechanism you use to kill it into a setting that works, you know, into the cave or mine setting, and really target just that fungus and not a lot of other naturally occurring things in a cave or mine. And then another kind of difficult step is do you have to do it forever, right? Like, I mean, we have white nose here. Once this fungus gets into a cave or mine, it seems to be persistent. So is this a treatment you have to do till eternity? Like, what does that look like, right? So that's the only caveat with treatments, is just trying to figure out how to really make it practical and implement it. So there's no treatment that's commercially available right now, but yeah, there still is a lot of research on that. So hopefully we can figure something out, but that's where things stand for now. I don't see any other questions.
I think we had a question through the chat from Samantha.
Okay.
Has there been any talk of climate change possibly slowing the rate of white nose since it's a cold-loving fungus?
Yeah, that has been, the only thing I've heard about that is it's kind of just batted around sort of anecdotally, like, what is this going to look like? But I've not seen any peer-reviewed literature or experimental research coming out about that. So I would think we would at some point tackle that and maybe take some sort of, whether it's like a climate modeling approach or something, to try to figure out if there's any chance that that could help with this. But yeah, right now, don't know of anything that's come out that's formal about that.
And I had a question too. When you've been misnetting and other survey techniques, what's the farthest away you found a bat from? Like, have you found bats tagged by other people in different states? Or
Yeah, that does happen. It hasn't happened to me personally. I wish. It's actually a pretty low recapture rate, so we get like really excited when we get any recapture. The kind of the coolest find for me is one time we caught a bat. This was maybe in 2016 at a site that we misnet every year, and it's been misnetted since probably 2000 or 2001. And we caught a bat that was 13 years old. So that was really neat. It was at least 13 years old because it was originally banded when it was an adult. And with bats, we age them in the field by saying adult or juvenile. And juvenile means like it's born this summer. So we can't say like, oh, this is a 4-year-old bat or something. So that bat was an adult when it was caught, and then I caught it 13 years later. So that was pretty cool that it was at least 13 years. As far as movements though, some of the bigger movements are seen in gray bats. Gray bats are pretty migratory. They tend to go pretty far distances, and they group up together in a few select caves in just thousands of gray bats. And so sometimes bats in Tennessee will have been banded in Alabama, so that's a pretty cool record for that species. But here in North Carolina, we see our gray bats going back and forth to Tennessee, but not like super far in Tennessee. Yeah.
cool. Is there a typical like lifespan for bats? Probably different for a different species, but
Yeah, so bats tend to be pretty long-lived, contrary to what probably people would think. I think the longest known record is 41 years, but there are several different records in the 30s for little brown bats. So that's pretty cool. I mean, we think in the wild that they probably live less than 20 years most often, but they definitely can live 20 to even 30 years. Good question.
awesome. Okay, I think that's all the questions that have popped up. I want to thank both of you so much for joining us and getting this book together and learning Zoom so we could still do this, but just virtually. So thank you guys so much for your presentations. I know I learned a lot, so hopefully everybody else did too. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much, guys.